Hi, I'm Colin Massey, Horticulture Agent at the Washington County Extension Office.
Hello, I'm Ryan Neal, Ag Agent for Benton County, and we're here at Appleseed's Teaching Farm.
Hello, my name is Cale Nicholson, and we are here at the Appleseeds Teaching Farm. I am the garden manager for Appleseeds. Our motto is inspiring healthy living through garden-based education. And as you can see, we're in the high tunnel. We have a lot of crops growing, winter crops, cool weather crops, greens and roots mostly. We're going to talk about pruning our orchard today. We have about a 50 tree orchard. We have about 25 apple trees, 15 pear trees. We have a few mulberry trees. And so this is the time of year that we need to prune the trees. We're in the last part of February. So the trees are all in their dormant stage and haven't bloomed out or budded out at all yet. We established this orchard, I want to say, in the winter of 2015, and so we're coming up on our 5th year of growing season here. The trees are doing well. They're starting to produce. We did harvest a lot of pears last year, and we're starting to get more and more apples, and we're expecting to harvest more of those this year.
With ornamental trees, we're often pruning for our human purposes, whether that be strength of the tree, safety, avoidance of electrical lines or utilities, or even aesthetics. With fruit trees, it's a little bit different. Our main goal is to produce high quality fruit, to prune for disease prevention. We're also pruning for training and structure. And one of the key components to pruning fruit trees, what we want is good light penetration and air circulation within that canopy to promote drying. That's a key way to prevent a lot of waterborne and airborne diseases from taking hold in our orchards. So we also want to think about why we're pruning this time of year. As Cale mentioned, we're in the last week of February. So generally we want to do most of our fruit tree pruning while the plant is dormant, but while the real danger of real heavy frost or freezing has mostly passed. A couple of advantages to pruning while that tree is dormant is, one, you can see much better what needs to be cut when there's not a lot of dense foliage on there. You have less material to remove. The bark's going to be less likely to heal, but the main advantage is we're pruning just before that flush of spring growth, which is going to promote those wounds to heal much quicker.
So there are 3 types of tools that we generally think about when we go out into the orchard to prune. Probably our most versatile, because it allows us to cut both small wood and larger wood, is a simple handsaw. This one, as you can see, folds, which makes it fit easily into your back pocket. You can unfold it and it stays quite sharp. These are a little bit more difficult to sharpen, so generally at about $20 to $30, folks, just as they get dull, decide to buy a new one or replacement blade. So this is a handsaw, and it will allow us to cut both large and small wood. The downside for this is it does tend to be a little bit slower if we generally have young plants and small wood. That's why probably my second choice would be to have a simple pair of bypass hand pruners. This also doesn't have to be real expensive. You could spend as much or as little as you want. This pair of quality bypass pruners costs about $20, and it can be sharpened, and so can generally be used indefinitely. It does also allow you to replace the blade if you wanted to get a brand new one or if it was to get damaged. What makes this a bypass pruner is the blades, as you can see, will bypass each other. So similar to a pair of scissors would be, as opposed to some of the cheaper models out there which tend to be an anvil type pruner, where there's one solid piece and then the sharp piece just hits up against that. They don't tend to make as nice of a cut or as clean of a cut, and can leave a little bit of bark which could cause problems later on. So I would recommend a pair of hand pruners and get the bypass type to make a cleaner cut. The next would be a pair of bypass loppers, and this would cut larger things. Generally we can get up with a pair like this to 2.5 inches before we're really straining both our bodies but our tools, and also probably causing damage to the plant itself. You know, any time that you're really having to squeeze hard with your hand, or you're having to twist this thing or turn it as you cut, you're probably trying to bite off more than you can chew, and you should step it up to either a pair of loppers like this or to a hand saw. So just trying to match up the right tool for the job can make it both easier on your body, easier on the tool, and then easier on the plant. So an important part of pruning is maintaining your equipment. In the case of hand pruners like these bypass hand pruners, some of the maintenance involved is, you know, cleaning off at the end of the day. You can also lubricate with some white lithium grease that you would spray on and then wipe off the excess. A lot of the brands like Felco will sell a brand name lubricant that they have their own name on, and they can, you know, sell along with pruners. But, you know, generally keeping things lubed up is good, and will just make it easier on the equipment and your hands. Also, sharpening is something that needs to be done, you know, probably every hour, every 30 minutes. The more you keep your equipment sharper, the better the cuts will be, the easier it'll be on your equipment and hands, and so it'll really go a long ways. You can buy new blades and replace the blades, and you could sharpen them at the end of the day and switch out throughout, or have a couple of pair of these at $20 a piece. But you can also just carry out with you a small file like that. They have some called a diamond hone that are a little bit easier to carry and smaller, but just a general file can do a really good job. This one's got a fine texture on one side and a coarse texture on the other, so that you can really fine-tune things. It's a little bit difficult to get the angle right on the inside of these pruners, so you'll want to have these all the way open as much as you can at least. And the fact that they're bypass means that only one side of that blade is sharp, and so, you know, there's no need to sharpen both sides. And actually, if you were to sharpen or try to take off some material off the inside of that, it's going to widen the gap, and it's not going to make as nice of a cut. So you really want those two blades to just come as close to each other as possible. So you're only going to want to take metal off of that outside edge. And so, you know, that kind of sets up the angle for you just naturally, because that's as best you can get the tool in there. But you're just going to want to kind of take a little bit of that metal off, and then you're going to kind of fold it back so it's not going in between the two blades. And so I'm just going to go in here, probably start with the coarse one, and maybe just run it over the blade 3 to 5 times. And then I'm going to do the same thing with the fine blade and go over that 3 to 5 times. And like I said, the angle is kind of kept natural because that's just the best you can get this tool in between the two blades. But do that, you can kind of feel on it, and we certainly want to get off, you know, any big chunks where maybe we've damaged the blade. And over time we'll probably just want to replace these if we're doing a lot of pruning, you know, once a year, once every couple years. This is a pair that, though, I've maintained for about 5 years, and it still seems to be working just fine. You know, we can also do the same thing with a pair of loppers. Tends to be a little bit easier because these will open up quite wide. You know, it's probably something you would want to do on a table, so you don't have to worry about this thing closing in on you or something. But the same type of deal, just going in and just kind of taking off any burrs that might have formed and just sharpening it up. And again, that'll just make a much better cut for the tree and for you. Generally, things like this, our hand saws, it's better just to replace the entire blade, because it's very difficult for you to be able to sharpen this yourself without special tools. That would probably be cost prohibitive for an individual. So when approaching a tree, there's a few things that I like to look at before making any cuts. One would be any signs of damage. As we see here, we've got a few places where potentially a deer has been rubbing on the tree, or maybe some other animal. If we're seeing a lot of consistent damage like that, especially in the fall of the year during deer season and rut, Then we might look to build a fence around here as a barrier to keep animals away. You can certainly cause damage if it's on the main trunk. If it was to girdle, it could kill the entire tree. Another thing I want to look for is holes in the trunk that could lead to borer damage or bee borer damage. So there could be an insect in there that's eating and chewing on some of the inside of the trunk and could cause problems or potential death to the plant. Another thing would be disease like fire blight. It's very common for apple trees, even if they have some resistance to fire blight, to consistently get fire blight and have it be a problem. It needs to be something that be pruned out as you see it during the year, but certainly eliminate it right now when we're doing the majority of our pruning work. So look for any kind of blackening of bark or damage that might be a signal of some sort of disease. You'd want to go ahead and get that and remove it out of the orchard altogether. Another thing is to look for any kind of suckers that might be coming out of the base of the tree. That likely is coming below the graft union, and so it's not likely to be part of a tree that would produce a good fruit anyway. Could also be a sign of distress. So if it's too wet here or if we're over irrigating, that could be a sign that we need to make some changes. Another thing to consider when we plant our tree is the use of stakes and also fencing. And if it's a thin bark tree like a maple or these apple trees, consider putting a trunk wrap on it to protect the bark. So right here you can see there is some fencing panels. Cattle panels work great. You can also use hardware cloth that can prevent deer or armadillo or rabbit damage. They also have a nice heavy T-post here. If we were in a heavily winded area or an area that would potentially lean the tree over, we'd want to probably stake this thing and tie it for maybe 2 years or something. You really don't want the tree to depend on getting staked for more than about 2 years. It'd be similar to leaving a cast on your arm for too long. It would just lead to an overall weak tree, which we don't want going forward. But for the first couple of years, to try to promote good upward growth, staking is a good idea. And then, like I said, a trunk wrap can both protect the trunk from animals, but also sun scald. So specifically, whenever the tree loses its leaves in the fall, it can become real susceptible to sun scald. That's particularly important if you're planting an ornamental tree like a maple.
So now that we're ready to prune, as Ryan mentioned, we're going to have a few priorities to look at before we start making some cuts. Ryan mentioned first looking for any damage, disease, or dead wood. That's going to be our first priority of branches to remove. The next thing we're going to look at are any branches that are growing back towards the center of the canopy or possibly crossing another limb and rubbing, which can create a wound. That can be a foothold for a pathogen. The third thing we're going to look at would be any competition for our main leader. You know, most of our apples and pears want to be in a central leader system compared to something like a stone fruit that would have an open center, kind of that upside down umbrella look that you get a lot of air circulation and light into. And finally, we're going to look for any weak, nearly vertical growth. Now, these are typically what we would call water sprouts or suckers. That vertical wood has a poor branching structure that is prone to breaking. It doesn't support quality fruit, and it can take energy away from the plant. Ready to make our cuts. There's a number of different pruning techniques that we can use, and we're going to favor what's called a thinning cut over something called a heading cut. A thinning cut means we're going to remove a branch back to its point of origin, such as this branch that has some deer damage. We're going to cut that back onto a main stem, and that is a thinning cut, as opposed to something that we see here, where we've just shortened the length of a main stem or a branch. That's called a reduction cut. That's going to cause a flush of those water sprouts or possibly even suckers off of this branch. And when we make our cuts, we want to be sure that we're not cutting flush with the stem. There's an area called the branch collar. Sometimes you'll see a branch bark ridge. We want to cut right outside of that collar. And the reason being is that much of that healing tissue is located in this area, when the active growth of this plant starts, it's going to have a much better chance of healing over. If we cut flush, that wound is not usually going to heal completely over. It could be a pathway for pathogens. Another thing I'm concerned about is the weight of this branch. If that falls off a cut, it could be doing some bark stripping, especially if we're using a saw. So we'll employ a method called the 3-cut method. And the first step is to help relieve some of that weight. We're going to make a cut on the underside of this heavier limb about halfway through the branch. Next, we're going to go just outside of that and make a cut fully through while supporting that branch with our hand. And that will pop that off and make sure that we don't strip the bark. Now that the weight is gone and we're not worried about this being heavy enough to strip the bark, we can make our cut. And we want to do this outside of what we call the branch collar. So we're going to take a look at this, get just outside of that, and make our final cut. There we have a clean cut that's going to heal over well.